a monthly webinar series where we will be covering what we believe are hot topics in cybersecurity, starting today with our view on why protecting privileged accounts is more important than ever. My name is Anders, and I'm leading the PwC Cybersecurity Advisory and Assurance Services in Sweden, where we strive to be relevant for our clients from the boardroom all the way to the SOC floor. I will start this session with a short introduction and the view of current threat trends and why we think that privileged access management should be on every organization's agenda. With us today, we also have Josh Kirkwood from CyberArk, who will give us an understanding of what privileged access is, who privileged users are, and why they need to be protected, and how the CyberArk solutions can be used to achieve adequate protection. In addition to technology, our belief is that we also need to address the people and process perspectives to be successful in our privileged access management implementation. My colleague Marcus Broman will give us a view of where and how to start a journey to protect privileged access in your organization. We will finally end the session with a short Q&A. Please use the chat within this meeting to post questions along the way. So let's get started. In our annual global CEO survey, we are seeing that CEOs are becoming increasingly concerned about the threat and impact of cyber attacks. In the beginning of 2019, cyber threats entered into the top 5 concerns of global CEOs and has since made its way to become the second biggest concern by the start of 2021. Talking to CEOs of large Western European companies, cyber threats is the top concern. So what is actually causing these concerns? Based on our support to clients that have suffered a cyber attack during 2020, we are seeing some trends emerging. The major cause of concern is the rapid rise of ransomware. What we're seeing in news reports is only the tip of an iceberg. Ransomware actors are changing their tactics by not just encrypting the data and requesting the target to pay a ransom. They are now also threatening to publish the data if the ransom is not paid. Attackers are also becoming more motivated and attacks humanly operated to persist within the target to ensure that the data they steal and encrypt is of real value to the organization. Secondly, we also see that phishing campaigns and business email compromise attacks are being tailored to the current situation. Most recently, we have been seeing fraudulent thank you and bonus emails in the attempt to lure employees into clicking on malicious links in order for the attacker to gain access. And thirdly, there's a rising concern about supply chain attacks, similar to what we have seen with SolarWinds and the major impact that had on many of SolarWinds' customers. So if we deep dive into the topic of ransomware, we have over the last year seen a growing number of actors, and they are attracted by what is perceived as an easy revenue with a low risk and high return. Ransomware groups are running affiliate programs to grow their talent pool, and we are seeing new highly aggressive attackers in the wild. To reduce your vulnerabilities to these attacks, you have to understand both the attacks and your own vulnerabilities and deliver targeted improvements to rapidly reduce the risk and exposure both in the short and the longer term by building capabilities to deliver sustainable risk reduction. As you can see on the right-hand side here, protecting privileged accounts is one of the 6 priority actions that we recommend to rapidly and sustainably lower the risk and limit the impact of a ransomware attack. In our experience, poor protection of privileged accounts allows attackers to compromise credentials and succeed with the mission to reach, extract, and encrypt your most valuable data within 72 hours from the attacker's initial access. Privileged access management can help you mitigate the most common problems, such as overly privileged accounts, risky operating practices, and the use of insecure words and authentication mechanisms. Active Directory and other core directory and authentication stores hold the keys to the kingdom. These core systems are often viewed as IT productivity tools and not the security tools they should be considered as. Privileged access management can help you take control of those keys and make sure that they are protected. And with that, I would like to hand over to Josh. And Josh, what exactly is a privileged account and a privileged user?
Thank you so much, Anders. Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Kirkwood. I'm a Solutions Engineering Manager here at CyberArk. And I have the privilege of answering the ever-changing question of what is a privileged account. Now, this is something I find myself having to deal with on a regular basis, because a privileged account isn't something you immediately call out. We see a privileged account being part of a user's experience. At the moment, I'm talking to you from, funnily enough, a non-privileged account. But if I'm chosen to look at the statistics of the webinar at the end of this, I may be accessing what we consider customer data. And in our mind, that could potentially be a privileged account. And it sort of feeds into the story I tell you that every account ends up being a privileged account at some point. But we need to think about how to identify them, how to manage them, and sort of where they're going. Anders, if you could pull over to the next slide for me, please. When we look at this in sort of like a bigger picture view, we kind of see that privileged access happens across the entire business. This journey 5 years ago may have started with a PC in an office accessing a file store. It could have been an administrator accessing a domain controller. It would be relatively easy and understandable to map the course and action of a privileged account. The rub is that things have changed an awful lot. Every time I have a conversation with my Swedish colleagues in PwC, I'm always asking them, is that the office I see? Out of sort of envy. It's been 15 months since I stepped foot in my own office. My workplace has changed substantially. I've moved from a company-owned laptop to VDI infrastructure on a BYOD type policy because it was easier to solve technical challenges that way. I'm living the journey that we're going to describe on this slide because I'm now no longer a PC user in an office. Instead, I'm a home-based user in virtual infrastructure, and I still have the same requirements. I have to do my job effectively. That's a real challenge for me because, I have to be able to deliver the work that I promised, the outcomes that I'm offering, and get it all done. This means that user experience becomes a key part of this. If I could ask you to pull to the next slide for me, please. Now, when we think about user experience, what we have to consider is the journeys the users take. Hans, if you could trigger the first animation for me, please. The very first thing we might want to consider is just basic day-to-day tasks performed by a workforce user against systems. This may not be considered initially privileged, but we then may have to deal with things like third parties who require support access to environments, as well as, if you pop the next one for me, please, the developers. And I have a sort of slightly strange take on the concept of a developer. I argue about this continuously. I personally believe that anyone that writes code that moves a business forward is a developer. And it's quite a large definition, but what it means is that we have to treat these users that automate differently to how we would treat a workforce user. They have very different requirements, they do very different things, and we have to make sure that when they need privileged accounts, it's done in a sensible and considered way, because their access could end up being very highly privileged across the board. And then last of all, we have our traditional sysadmins. These individuals are often the last line of defense a business has around an outage. They need access to critical resources at all times of the night from all different places. And all of this starts defining a very challenging privileged journey because they're not just responsible for a given VM, they're responsible for a SaaS platform, cloud, or even on-prem. So we pop to the next slide. We'll flip it a little bit. We'll talk about what happens when these guys don't have that way, the checks in place they need. For us, it comes down to sort of three core challenges. The very first thing we're always looking to deal with is the idea of credential theft. We want to stop an attacker from getting a privileged account in the very first place, especially if that definition can be a little loose, depending on what an individual's doing. I'll call back to the ransomware examples at the beginning of this presentation. Recently, there was a fascinating piece of research. It's been discovered that some ransomware groups have been trying to rent user accounts from individual users, offering them an initial $500 for sign up when they hand over their credentials for their employer, and $125 a month for each month it still remains functional. And if you imagine that, these people are taking a realm of different attempts to gain a beachhead inside of an organization. This means that we're not just dealing with phishing. We're not just dealing with malware. We're not just dealing with your classic worms. What we're having to deal with is everything. We have to then think what happens once they've made their beachhead. An attacker can probably find their way into a system. The very next thing an attacker will almost always do in an attack is perform lateral and vertical movement. That's look around the system they've managed to find a beachhead, look for stored credentials, look for hashes, look for ways to land on the next system, because the next system may have more inherent access, more footprints that allow them access to other parts of the network and estate. Because once they've managed to get past that first wall, they're now in a situation where they may be able to access some critical business resources, or even find themselves in control of the entire network. To tie it back to the ransomware examples at the beginning of this call, the first thing I'll say is that this is all being automated. If you look at NotPetya from 2017, it actually automatically leveraged privileged accounts to move laterally and vertically throughout systems. It allowed them to achieve a total network takeover of many of the targeted environments. And when we think of the remediation exercise, this no longer is worrying about just running antivirus on the endpoints. Now we have to deal with the fact that the entire identity store is compromised. They've managed to perform something that our labs call a golden ticket attack and take over the entire domain. And this can be an absolute disaster. Sanders, if you could trigger me over to the next slide, please. Now, firstly, I'll tell you a little bit about this slide, because this slide's been with me at CyberArk for the entire time I've been here, and I found it in decks dating back to 2012. It's funny because the model is incredibly accurate. It describes the journey an attacker takes. And what we'll do is we'll map this against one of the more modern attack chains in a sec, but I'll talk you through the sort of genericized steps, because it's really interesting when you start mapping attacks you read about in the news to this. The first part of the journey is a threat, internal or external. We need to find the mechanism to stop them from escalating privilege. But if they do, they manage to get past my little firewall-shaped symbol and a squiggly line that makes it look like the spelling's bad. They find themselves in a situation where they land and start looking to escalate privilege. They're looking around, they're performing reconnaissance. Because at some point they'll find the next step in their journey that allows them to move laterally, until they get to a point when they have the permissions to do what they need to do. Now, when we say disrupt business, I still remember in 2017, I'd tell you that might be a quick ransomware, charge you for the decryption. I would say that potentially you might have a crypto mining style attack, but now it's terrifying, because they're also looking to exfiltrate the data. They ransom that back. They use it as proof that they've got control of your data. And it's all done in such an incredibly well run. Please forgive me for issuing a compliment, but the average attacker these days is not just one individual, it's a business. They have people seeking out networks, they have people working inside them to perform this journey, and then they have the people focused on the end game, where they're looking for a ransom or leaving with the data they want. So let's look how this works in a cloud estate, and then we'll go into some ways to deal with it. So I'm going to tell you a story about how we go from very basic misconfiguration to a news article and a fine and insurance being paid out and regulators and 106 million people getting a brand new offer of credit protection insurance. How wonderful for them. All it costs is their personal data. This one here started with an external threat. An attacker, and in this case, not a complex attacker, an individual, not the organization I described earlier, found a misconfigured web application firewall. Now, you're asking me, Josh, why am I talking about a web application firewall when I'm talking about privileged access? Well, we'll get there in a second, don't worry. And I'd call myself out on that because no one loves WAFs. The misconfigured WAF was running on an EC2 instance, which effectively meant that the misconfigured WAF allowed the attacker to contact an internal API with AWS. Now, if you're not familiar with how AWS works, one of the like magic parts of that cloud environment is there's an API that's available to every single element of the cloud that's deployed. And in this case, we have a VM that's able to query the API. It's able to say, what roles do I have aligned to me? This is where we come back to it being a user access problem. Now, that VM was aligned to a series of permissions stored in a role. The attacker was then able to leverage this API request forwarding to an internal API and get to a point where they had managed to get a token that allowed them access to it, managed to clarify that that individual WAF instance had access to sync and list S3 buckets. Now, this organization had done a good job in the sort of journey towards the cloud. Data was being stored in S3 buckets. But the problem here is that one of those buckets contained 106 million people's worth of data. And the attacker then used the sync bucket command, got the data, left, and then tweeted about it. Wasn't probably the smartest thing to do. That ended them up in a little bit of trouble, but the organization themselves was in a situation where they then had to contact 106 million customers and articulate that, yes, their data had been lost. Yes, they were generously going to offer them a year of credit protection insurance, but also, you know, they had to notify insurers, they had to notify regulators. It was a pretty difficult time, but it all happened from the misconfiguration of a role. And the worst part is that's now becoming an identity challenge. So I've taken you through a journey that really feels like it should be an issue placed upon the cloud infrastructure teams. But no, these are roles we're dealing with. This is an identity problem. And this is why privileged access is becoming top of mind for identity professionals and security leaders across the board, because it has to be controlled. So look, we'll move over to the next slide. And then we go back to the software supply chain. Now, this year, software supply chain has been absolutely top of mind for everyone. And I like to talk about another part of the software supply chain or technology supply chain, and that's third parties. I would imagine everybody in this call has a relationship with a third-party IT provider of some description. Me, in my past life, when I worked for a living rather than talked for a living, I worked as an infrastructure architect. The biggest challenge that would come across me on a sort of monthly, if not yearly basis, was having to find a way to get a Cisco TAC engineer into our core routers. A TAC engineer from Cisco is a technical assistance center engineer. They're part of the support function. Our core routers are, funnily enough, core routers. They lived as far away from remote access as possible. We had spent a very long time trying to make sure that people couldn't find their way into it. But we had to find a mechanism to permit that given individual, somebody from Cisco we'd never spoken to before, access into that environment. It's a real big challenge, and it represents a massive risk because we'd end up having to basically onboard them as employees over the course of the day. And whilst we had requirements to audit a third party before we granted them access to a system, we also had requirements to deliver services to our customers. And more often than not, when the routers are broken, you're really stressing out here. And these guys get given access, but they're part of our supply chain. And we have to think how we can manage this as well. And for me, this becomes a privileged access challenge because the third parties that are accessing our digital supply chain are involved in accessing the majority of our critical resources and sometimes performing incredibly privileged actions across the board. So, Anders, if you would be so kind as to pull me across to the last slide. We're going to have a chat here about how we can solve this. And I will say this is CyberArk's view, and my friends at PwC will happily qualify this and make sure it fits into your organization and processes and make sure that it works in a way that is appropriate for everything. But I'll talk you through a journey of how I feel it should be resolved. I'll call out some elements that are very interesting to consider, and it should give you a view of how we deal with this privileged account challenge. So look, the very first part of this journey starts with the type of user. If it's a first-party user, I'm generally assuming it's in some kind of identity platform. Be it the Active Directory we've spoken about as being an IT operations tool, or be it something stored in a more modern identity platform. We have one in our portfolio, but there's plenty out there. And normally, most businesses are at a point when they're starting to onboard into that type of identity store. If not, please talk to PwC. They can help you plan that. They get the access into the environment. A third-party user, they may not have an identity, but that's something we'll talk about in a sec. This secured remote access is something that we deliver ourselves, either through our cloud remote access tooling, or will be delivered through a VPN, or just by the fact that your individual user is present on an office network, which I hope to be soon, I'm not going to lie. This then puts me into a situation where I can log into a part of the CyberArk infrastructure. I can log into basically a website and request access to a given application. This is fantastic because I can then say, please can I have SSH to a server? The next thing that happens is that access will be validated. Should I have access to it? Am I coming in from the right place? Is it normal? Is there a requirement for it to be escalated for somebody to approve? That's a choice that's made. If that happens, it might be another user, it might be in the office this time. They approve it, grant me access, and I'm able to carry on doing my job. The really cool part is that session is logged, isolated, managed. It's something that's taken away from being my concern. I've not handled a privileged account. Instead, that privileged account lives inside our vault. That could be stored within an on-prem vault. It could be a vault hosted in the cloud. It could be a vault hosted in your own private cloud. There are many different ways of achieving it. And our session isolation infrastructure can be spread across your entire estate to deliver it in the most appropriate way. When it comes back to a third party, we have to deal with that challenge around their identity. This can often be, as I've already said, a massive challenge because, quite frankly, you don't want to onboard them. You don't want to deal with the fact that their individual IT requirements may not have the full requirements that you have on your own users. They may have local admin. They may be in a situation where they don't store credentials in the way that your business expects. Instead, you choose to onboard them into our third-party access solution. We can deal with the temporary identity. We can provision them a very short-lived account for the purpose of the task and broker them access into the critical application they need to access without any challenge. It's a really smooth journey. And if I go back to when I actually had to deal with this, it will be way easier than the WebEx screen share I ended up doing into my personal account signed into a core router with said Cisco TAC engineer. So yeah, this basically represents the beginnings of a privileged access journey. I think it's something to consider. I can absolutely understand why it's top of mind for a given security leader. So I believe, Anders, that's the end of my slides. If it's okay with you, I'm going to hand back to Marcus, who's going to talk about running this as a larger program across the entire estate.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. So with that in mind, we want to take let's say a step back and provide a point of view and let's say some keys and key takeaways for you to unlock business value and recognize that PAM and the PAM journey is not just about implementing any given product or technology stack to make it technically possible, but also understanding why and how this is relatable to your organization, your business. And I really liked what Josh said about user experience. So what we really believe and what I've seen personally is that if you keep your user experience top of mind within the PAM perspective, you can almost get to a point where nobody will even notice that there's a privilege escalation happening with their account because there's a seamless process and use case defined that just basically works as part of your normal authentication process. But I'll talk you through 3 keys to unlock this business value that we think about and what we see being absolute critical success factors in the PAM journey. And the first one is really about recognizing risks and contextual controls. And what that means is that it's not just about a tech solution. It's about what risks does your organization have? What risks is it you're trying to solve in the short, medium, and long term of your strategy from a security point of view? What controls does make sense for you to put in place? Is it about having MFA? Is it about securing endpoints for your third parties? Or is it about ensuring nobody can access your domain controllers? There are different controls for different purposes. And we love to provide you with heaps of controls, but it needs to make sense for you and there needs to be the right controls for the right risks. And that's really where we see it's a key factor to consider, that you must have some level of understanding of this, but it's really about figuring out what is right for you. And with that in mind, we obviously want to accelerate into an implementation of a solution. We all love solutions to our technical problems. And that's, again, it can be the same problem or the same risk can be resolved in many different ways. It doesn't have to be a particular technical product. It can be a workaround with a piece of paper, but it's all about figuring out what is the speed to value that we can deliver. What is the business value that this PAM journey can take you on, and how can you either help your business work remotely, or how can you help your business accelerate new and onboard new privileged accounts? It's really about figuring out how can we be operationally efficient in a smooth way. And that really brings us to the third point, which is the PAM journey is not about just risk and control. It's about enabling the business to do what it requires to do in a safe way. And if we talk about safe, I'm predominantly thinking about the risks that we face today, about ransomware, about third-party and supply chain attacks. We want the business to be enabled to do their job in a secure and controlled way, so that you, as security or PAM owners within your company, can say, we trust and we know that we have adequate measures in place and that the business can do their job perfectly. If you go to the next slide, please. We also are very much happy to help you on this journey through two predominant accelerators, if you will, on a tiering model and on a control framework. I really like the control framework because it really takes the onus away from what you select as to be your solution, but it gives you a very good understanding of what are the controls that you can apply to protect you against 7 different attack chains. And I know Josh showed that privilege escalation view earlier. We can break that down further and work with you to understand what are the controls that you currently are working with. How can we enable them to be expanded into further controlling your PAM enterprise? But it also helps us to put in measurements and strategic plans to enable your strategy and vision and roadmap to feel secure and be in control. And often with the tiering model, that tends to start at what we refer to as tier 0. That's your domain admins. That's your keys to the kingdom. That's exactly what attackers we see today are trying to find and leverage and gain that privilege escalation towards. And that's really typically where you want to start as well. Figure out how do you secure your keys to the kingdom first, and then you expand into the bottom tiers of the pyramid, because that's really where you add more complexity. But the key risk and the high risk accounts tends to be the one in tier 0, which is close to your domain and sysadmins. And what all this sort of brings together as the bigger picture is what you see on the left-hand side, which is the PAM maturity model. That's really when we have come a bit on the journey to a matured PAM practice. It's really about figuring out what does good look like for you? What is your current state? What do you want to be? Are you on the right journey? Are you on the right track to achieve your targets? Are you compliant with what you say you are trying to achieve? And that's really where we want to, again, recognize the right risks and the contextual controls that are essential for you to enable the business on a PAM journey. And if we go to the next slide, I'll start to talk about a bit how we can assure an accelerated adoption of PAM. So as a PAM service provider, we can figure out what use cases, architectures, and methodologies makes the most sense for you and your organization to adopt PAM. Now, this really means that we start with the previous slide to have an understanding of what are the risks and controls that we are trying to achieve here together, but then adopting that into a more practical approach and saying, here's exactly how it's going to look like. Here's exactly how we want to build and design and deploy our privileged account and service reference architecture in a way that we can experience a better operational efficiency than what we have today. And where do we start? Well, as I said, we start with the core It's all about figuring out the starting point, and that's really what we want to emphasize as well, that we can rapidly onboard accounts throughout the whole enterprise. But that's an exercise that requires you to understand and feel confident that you're doing it in the right order. Figuring out if you need to onboard your network team or your DevOps team or your cloud team initially, that's really part of the journey as well, to understand what are the key risks and controls. As well as exactly the user guides and playbooks and checklists are more targeting both the operational team, but also figuring out how do you explain this to your organization. It shall not just be a technical part of your business that focuses on this, because a privileged account can be almost any account within your organization at any given point. And that's really something we've seen, and we want to make sure that we communicate as clearly as possible that this is a business transformation that is happening while you take on your PAM journey. It's a transformative change. It shouldn't be a disruptive one, because your business should be enabled and grow and adopt along the journey. So if we go to the next slide, this goes into what does a good delivery model look like? Well, PwC have several times been able to operationalize a very succinct project model, which basically can take us from the assess, prepare, evaluate phase into a deployment in roughly 12 weeks. Now that means we are able to help you understand your risks, prepare sufficient controls, select the key pilot scope, and assess your current state in a way that we can deploy an architectural solution that fits your organization, your initial scope, and make that work in production for your tier 0 accounts, your domain admins. This is really only at the start, but it can tell you and give you insights into how long time should it take for your PAM journey to start evolving. It's not about years, it's not about quarters. It can be done in a very short amount of time if you have the ambition to rapidly enhance your posture within the PAM space. And as a final note, I do want to recommend a key thing that we see most organizations often needs to do in one way or another, and that's really what we put on next slide as well. And that's understanding your current state. Where do you start? Well, luckily enough, and Josh, this is a really good call out for you as well, the CyberArk DNA scan is really a low touch software, which is free of charge, and it scans your AD domain. It scans for servers, privileged accounts, both in Windows and Unix systems. It identifies all privileged passwords, SSH keys, and hashes on your domain, on your servers, and all user stores that it can find. And it gives you a snapshot of really what does your AD look like today. And that really serves as valuable and key insight and input into expanding and starting and establishing your PAM journey. Now, obviously, most of you probably will be working with cloud environments as well. Well, we've used it, and we've seen additional scans that we can do to do the same type of insights into AWS, Azure as well. Give you insight into what are the roles your privileged user accounts have in those environments, and what is it we need to remediate, and are there any key risks and issues that really must be actioned by your team. And that's really what I want to give you and provide us to say, this is exactly where you should start. You should figure out your current state. Once you have that, it's really not too complicated to continue your journey to a PAM modern world environment. And with that, I want to hand it back to you, Anders, for the final section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus, and Josh as well for your valuable insights. So far, I don't see any questions, so I will kick off with a question of my own. And please put any questions into the chat if you have one. And I think I'll start with a question for you, Josh. I mean, we've been talking about server infrastructure, cloud infrastructure, applications, and so on. In my example with the ransomware, it kind of starts on the endpoint, on the user's workstation. what can we do about that? How can we stop that in an efficient manner?
That's a brilliant question. So I'll answer it from a CyberArk perspective, and I'll give some tips from a slightly larger perspective. I personally think a lot of this comes from like training and making users aware of the danger, around email, around what they plug in, flash drives, so on. But what we recommend is making sure that you take away unnecessary permissions, achieve least privilege on the endpoint. The idea of that is that you basically take away often the local admin your users have, remove their abilities to install software, which can frustrate many different elements of malware, retrieve credentials from LSAS, which is where you'd normally find the credentials of, say, a support administrator that once logged in there, the beginning of the lateral movement part of this journey, or secure the browser credential stores, which often may end up having another cred stored in there that's used to log into another system. We talk about infrastructure, but that cred could be something that maybe logs them into a HR information system, which allows an attacker to perform additional reconnaissance, which could result in them finding the names of everybody in the sysadmin team. So they can go and contact them individually and try and fish them to get on a better beachhead. And once you've done this, the next challenge you'll actually find is a user suddenly jumping back into your grill and saying, we miss the ability to change time zones on our computers to control which printers we're using and things like this. And there is a CyberArk solution here for handling escalation to make least privilege on the endpoint way more palatable. And I know PwC have had some great success actually looking at how this plugs together as part of a larger program. So that would be through the sort of management of endpoint privilege. How's that for a long-winded answer?
Very, very interesting, definitely. And maybe a question for Marcus as well. I mean, PwC is of course an audit and internal audit support firm as well. And looking at privileged access, do you think there's anything that auditors and internal auditors can kind of look at from a controls perspective to ensure that we are dealing with privileged access in a proper manner?
Absolutely. I think most of the controls that we see currently being adopted is really they tend to be quite manual, to be frank. If we look at when we look at organizations and how they manage privileged accounts today, it's most about manual controls and manual hand-made changes to certain accounts. It's not really what we see can be done in a consistent way. So from a controls perspective, the compliance with privileged accounts is certainly there, but the operational efficiency of how to manage privileged accounts for basically your whole organization is not really something we've seen so far. And it's absolutely, in my mind, something that relates back to why we see so many easy, low-hanging fruit attacks being successful, because there's just a lack of insights into what is it we need to be cautious about, because we have auditors in place who say we are doing a fantastic job, and yet we are getting exposed to certain risks and attacks. So that's really something that we start to see as well, that there needs to be not more controls necessary, but greater and efficient controls to hinder that lateral movement and that risk exposure with your identities and accounts.
Can I jump in here as well? Because you've touched on something that I never really talk about in a webinar, but I think it's something that really needs to be called out. And you've definitely got the experience in talking about it. And it is the user experience, because I think that you need to choose solutions that secure your organization, but you should also make sure that literally the second thought after the will it make it more secure is, will people absolutely hate using it, and how can I avoid that happening? And doing it well and doing it as part of a considered program is absolutely the way to avoid people hating it. No one wants security to make their lives harder. We should be enablers, not blockers. And as you called out, doing it in ways that are empathetic to a user's workload will make their lives 1,000 times easier and make our lives easier, right? Next audit, there won't be the problems and there won't be people bypassing them because they hate the ways you've tried to fix it. So yeah, sorry.
think that's an excellent point to wrap up with. Simplify for your people and your users to do things in a secure manner. That's a good point. And with that, I would like to thank everyone who participated in this first PwC Cyber Talk. Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Josh, for presenting.